Welcome to Alaska Weather, a production of Alaska Public Media and the National Weather Service, Alaska Region. Produced and broadcast daily from the studios of KAKM, Alaska Weather provides complete forecasts, public, marine, and aviation for all of Alaska. Alaska Weather is made possible by the following sponsors.
Indie Alaska is an innovative weekly web series capturing the diverse and colorful lifestyle of Alaskans. Real stories of everyday Alaskans at work and play. Supported in part by Alyeska Pipeline Service Company.
The National Weather Service.
Good evening, everyone. I'm meteorologist Dave Snider with the National Weather Service. It's the 22nd of November, and as always, we encourage you to stay up to date with your latest weather information. Whether you get that from Marine VHF, NOAA Weather Radio, or the internet, we encourage you to check that often. You can find us at weather.gov/Alaska or arh.noaa.gov, and on the Anchorage side, there are some mobile versions that'll be a little bit friendlier to your cell phone connection. The weather info line is open as well at 800-472-0391. You can find us on Facebook under NWS Alaska, on Twitter at NWS Alaska, as well as the other local office accounts. If you look for AKwx, that's the hashtag that continues the conversation about all Alaska weather, whether you're following the National Weather Service accounts or not. We encourage you to use that and find us on YouTube as well under NWS Alaska, NWS Anchorage, and NWS Fairbanks. Here's a look at what's going on across the region this evening. Wind advisory still in effect around the upper Koyukuk Valley there and around the Bettles region and Hughes. We continue to see some stronger breezes there, a little bit occasional gusts, so that will continue to settle down as we head into tonight. But for now, a wind advisory is still in effect through tonight and into early tomorrow morning. And as that subsides, we expect the turbulence that goes along with that for all of you aviators to settle down as well. So conditions should gradually be improving through the nighttime hours and into tomorrow morning. But for right now, still some stronger gusts there along and just north of the Yukon Valley. As we look ahead in time, you'll notice the satellite picture out across the Bering Sea still showing that circulation right around the Alaska Peninsula. Really no change in that since yesterday, except for that pressure level is coming up. That means it's all filling in slowly and surely. So this again is just kind of weakening in its organization and its structure and its intensity, I guess, as we get from the last couple days to about this point. Looking southward, you can see a batch of convection there across the central and western Pacific. That continues to track right along the jet stream, which is located well to our south. In fact, you can see that line traced out right about here in the cloud cover. The powerful jet stream there across the Pacific is well south of Alaska, and that's really keeping the major storm track right now from impacting most of the Gulf, the Aleutians, or anywhere in the Bering Sea at this point. In the meantime, we're heading for more of a northerly flow. Colder air is dropping out of the Bering Sea, and eventually, as we head toward the end of next week, it looks like we'll get into more of a colder pattern for more places in Alaska. Now, if you're an Arctic village, you're saying it's cold enough. It's 26 below is one of the lowest temperatures seen in the entire state today, and many areas along the upper Yukon and the south side of the Brooks Range were really in that deep freeze area throughout the day. Most of the Gulf Coast, most of the Aleutians, most of the West Coast really were in the 20s, 30s, even 40s. Now, the central and eastern interior, as well as the south side of the Brooks Range, were just trapped in that very cold weather thanks to a mainly clear sky and getting you off to a pretty cold start earlier this morning. You can see some of the precipitation working its way into southeastern Alaska. Each one of these batches of clouds is a little bit convective in nature. That means the air is bubbling up and probably bringing some passing showers through your region. Some of that was reaching into Prince William Sound today from Cordova all the way around to Whittier and southward towards Seward. Some of that was occasionally moderate to maybe even heavy. Out across the west of the Alaska Range and across the west coast, a lot of dry air there working its way offshore. Offshore winds continue for most areas there in the west today, and some patchy cloud cover working through the central and eastern Aleutians was bringing some rainfall there, along with some northerly winds working their way through on the western side of that low pressure system, sitting very close to Sand Point and really not moving very much at all throughout the day. North of the Alaska Range, the skies were pretty clear. Most of what the satellite's picking up on in this case is just the cold air across the interior and northern sections of Alaska. The good news is, too, winds are settling down across the Arctic coast. While they are still blustery at times, it looks like the main threat for those really stronger offshore winds and winds right along the coast themselves should be settling down with time. Here's a look at the weather map then. As we look at southeastern Alaska, we did see some patches of rainfall and even some snow up around Snider. A trough of low pressure was working its way northward along the periphery of high pressure located across the northern parts of Yukon, 1,020 millibars there compared to the low across the Alaska Peninsula and near Sand Point at 972 millibars. Colder air continues to work its way in from the north to the south, and that northerly flow affecting Adak, Atka, and Shemya today. Fairly clear sky across the interior, a patchy area of snow there south and west of Wainwright to about Point Lay, Point Hope, and areas of blowing and drifting snow across the central and eastern Beaufort Seacoast. Tonight, low pressure develops on the western areas of the Brooks Range at 1,003 millibars. Not terribly strong, but it's interrupting that flow a little bit, and that should lead to some changes there in your weather pattern. A little bit more cloud cover running down through the Bering Strait, and we still have a wide area of dry weather from Norton Sound all the way out toward Eagle. Southward there, clouds build in a little bit. Watch for some light accumulations of snow around some parts of the 40-mile country and around Tok, northward toward Eagle, Northway. Snow showers along the Alaska Range, southward toward the Wrangell-St. Elias region. We'll see some patchy areas of coastal rain showers across southeastern Alaska. Prince William Sound looking at an increasing threat for rainfall as we head into the rest of the weekend. Kodiak still looking wet. Some patchy areas of rain and snow showers across the Alaska Peninsula. And northward, don't be surprised to see some snow showers around south central, including the Kenai Peninsula, even the Anchorage Bowl. Light rainfall is possible for the central and eastern chain, but northward you get into a lot more of a drier situation. That includes the St. Matthew Island waters and the Pribilofs. By tomorrow, the low pressure system across the Alaska Peninsula scoots a little bit further to the east at 989 millibars. That's going to drag more places like False Pass and Cold Bay into more of a northerly flow. And again, that could affect some areas with some brief gap breezes there. It doesn't look terribly strong just yet, but if you're in one of those windier places there on the southern tip of the Alaska Peninsula, be ready for some occasional gusts. Across some south central areas into the Copper River Basin, we'll see a better chance for snow showers there, especially in the morning, and then it'll just be hit and miss snow showers, mainly along the higher terrain. Watch for some light rainfall across southeastern Alaska as we get into Sunday afternoon, and out across the west, a new player is entering into the western Bering Sea. At 987 millibars, we'll introduce an occluded front to the western Aleutians. You can still see a ridge of high pressure coming in from the north across the Gulf of Anadyr and also interrupting the flow across the central chain. That will slow the onset of that low pressure system into the Bering Sea initially as we head through Sunday. Conditions stay dry generally north of the Yukon as we get into Sunday afternoon. By Monday, the trough is moving eastward across the interior, and that will continue to keep a clear sky for most of the Seward Peninsula and Kotzebue Sound region, as well as parts of the Arctic coast around AKwx, where conditions have been fairly breezy. You'll be looking at more of an offshore flow there for the extreme eastern sections of the Beaufort Seacoast. For Barrow, look for clouds to drop southward, and that could bring some fog into your region, maybe as far south and west as Wainwright. For southeast, a trough that's remnants of that old occluded front that's been hovering across the north and eastern Gulf Coast will sit right over southeastern Alaska. With that, periods of moderate rainfall are still possible there with a south and southwesterly flow. It should be fairly light, but that will keep the moisture banked right up against your mountains. For south central, a better chance for snow showers across the higher terrain of the Kenai Mountains. Rainfall is likely around Prince William Sound, and scattered areas of rain may mix with snow across southwestern Alaska with periods of light rain for the Alaska Peninsula. Our front in the west is progressing eastward, and that triple point part of the weather system is moving its way across Adak and Atka, heading toward Nikolsky by Monday night and Tuesday morning. With that, you'll have some stronger winds develop as we get into Monday afternoon, passing over the eastern Aleutians and Unalaska. With that, to the west, westerly flow is still bringing in some wet weather for the central and western chain. Expect showers there around Kiska, out toward Adak and Atka, and dry weather continues for a large part of the west coast, with clouds starting to move eastward a little bit and out of the Bethel area perhaps by Monday afternoon. Here's a look at the weather pattern as far as temperatures go this afternoon. 30s and 40s again across southeast, a fairly wet day in Annette again, with temperatures in the upper 40s around Ketchikan. Saw about a quarter of an inch around Annette today, so soggy weather continues there. 38 in Yakutat, 43 in the capital city, 30s and 40s around Prince William Sound, 41 in Homer, 31 in Anchorage, 34 in Skwetna, 20s for Talkeetna, 3 around Healy today, 12 Fort Greely, and 6 in Fairbanks, with Eagle showing only 0 this afternoon, 1 below around Northway. 22 below was the 4 o'clock reading in Arctic Village. It began around 26 below, so you did get maybe a little bit warmer, not by much. 0 in Fort Yukon, 2 below in AKwx Pass, and low teens from Barrow eastward toward AKwx, primarily due to the winds that are still blowing. Around Wainwright, it was 5 above. Kotzebue saw temperatures around 11 degrees with Kivalina at 20. 9 in Shishmaref, 20 in Nome. Unalakleet was showing 16 degrees with McGrath at 11. Galena was a little bit cooler at 10 degrees. 17 in Bethel with Nunivak Island at 25, with St. Lawrence Island 32. The Pribilofs were hovering in the mid-30s with the Alaska Peninsula generally in the mid to upper 40s. Around False Pass and Cold Bay, we saw temps in the lower 40s there. Unalaska was 42. And it looked like Acatan was showing 41 at the airport. It had some periods of heavier rainfall around your region today as well. Mid-30s for Adak and Atka, and it was only 36 out in Shemya today. Overnight low temperatures will crash into the mid to upper teens again, looking at 15 to about 21 below for Fort Yukon up toward Arctic Village, probably getting a little bit colder than that. Southwestern temperatures in the upper 20s and lower 30s. South of Bristol Bay, look for temps to come closer to 40 degrees overnight. 35 in Kodiak, mid to upper 30s for a large part of southeast. Coastal areas might be closer to 40 degrees. Prince William Sound at or just above freezing. Barrow looking at 4, Nome expecting 6, and 22 in Nunivak Island with a high temperature there tomorrow of 25. Southwestern temperatures in the lower 40s tomorrow, about the same out and across the western chain. 43 in Kodiak, Seward and Homer in the mid to upper 30s, 7 below in Fort Yukon, 6 above in Fairbanks, and 9 above for Barrow, 12 above for areas around Kaktovik. And look for southeast to see temperatures in the mid-40s across the northern areas and a little bit closer to the coast. Some places like Sitka could get closer to 50 degrees. IFR flying conditions will continue to lurk very close to the Arctic coast thanks to the wind and low pressure lurking in the region. Look for marginal conditions, though, to probably push a little bit closer to the coastline as we head through the afternoon tomorrow. So some improvements will be seen there. Across the west coast, MVFR conditions run very close to the YK Delta. Most of the interior should be under VFR conditions, but watch for IFR conditions to develop quickly throughout the afternoon, especially along some of the major mountain passes, and VFR conditions for southeast and a large part of the chain, as well as the Alaska Peninsula. Let's take a look at those passes in detail. Anaktuvik and Adigan Pass look okay at this point. We're going to call VFR for those on Sunday. As we get into Lake Clark and Merrill Pass, watch for some changes to develop during the daytime there. You'll start out mostly VFR and lean over pretty quickly toward IFR conditions. So again, take a quick look at that before you leave. Randy Pass expecting IFR by late afternoon, and Windy Pass expected to see IFR develop there throughout the day. So we'll start out clear and conditions will change, much like Isabel Pass heading for IFR conditions there. Mentasta Pass, we expect to see improvements starting out at MVFR, leaning over toward VFR conditions. And Tanita Pass, we expect to see marginal conditions develop during the day. For Porter's Pass, expect IFR during the afternoon, starting out at MVFR, so conditions will worsen there. And Chilkoot and White Pass, expected to see marginal conditions throughout a good chunk of the day. Freezing levels indicate a little bit of overrunning still taking place across southeastern Alaska. Those conditions seem to be abating somewhat in the 2,000-foot freezing line, running right across the Alaska Peninsula. As that colder air continues to drop south, we'll see some more changes as we get ahead into Sunday, Monday, and in Tuesday there, as colder weather moves in from the north and from the west. Icing potential is about 4,000 to 5,000 feet in most areas. You can see that around the Alaska Range and southeast. Some pockets of moisture still lingering around that old frontal boundary. Now a trough across the north and eastern Gulf and across the Alaska Peninsula, generally above 4,000 feet. Didn't see a whole lot of icing reports from folks like you today. The jet stream shows the main corridor of weather activity coming out of eastern Asia and over the Pacific well south of Alaska. You can see some of the faster speeds there between 150 and 160 knots. The active weather progressing into the lower 48. We have another trough developing across eastern Asia, but for right now, most of Alaska seems to be kind of in the weather doldrums, kind of in between weather systems at this point with no major influence from one system or the other. And right under this low is what we have at the surface, that low pressure system just kind of lurking there at 9,000 feet and below. A northerly wind on the west side, as is typical for the northern hemisphere, 15 to 35 knots coming in right off of the Gulf of Anadyr all the way through the central chain. And on the eastern side of that, of course, a south and westerly flow blowing into southeastern Alaska, 35 to 45 knots, and generally light winds around the middle and upper Yukon Valley and the Brooks Range. Wind speeds there only 5 to about 10 knots. Wind speeds pretty light coming in across south central as well. At 3,000 feet, you see a 15-knot wind coming in pretty much due south over the Kenai Mountains and Prince William Sound. That's helping to keep moisture banked up right up against the higher terrain there. An offshore flow supported at this level from the Seward Peninsula through Kotzebue Sound and the YK Delta. Northerly still coming in through Adak and Atka around 30 knots, and southwesterlies really start to pick up. We'll see more moisture heading northward into the western Bering with that. 60-knot winds there south of Shemya and Kiska at this point. Turbulence factors, well, about 5,000 feet and below, you'll run into some chop. This should be getting better during the daytime across the Brooks Range and the middle Yukon Valley, across the Bering Strait below 5,000 feet, and you should still watch out for some turbulence across the central and eastern chain, generally below 4,000 feet and also to the west. That's a look at your aviation forecast. We'll be back in just a few minutes with the rest of your marine weather. Stay tuned.
A generation ago, America's air transportation system symbolized our national ideal of a bold, progressive country on the move. But as times change, so do society's priorities. Today, as commercial property values soar and residential development around airports burgeons, airplane noise has become a point of contention between the aviation community and the neighborhoods that now surround our airports. For some time now, public airports have been closing at the alarming rate of one each week. But it isn't just airports we're losing. Just as the noisy Boeing 707s, 727s, and Douglas DC-8s are disappearing from the nation's skies today, some communities are implementing operational restrictions so stringent that any airplane larger than a Cessna 152 or Piper Tomahawk may have trouble meeting them. Could our light general aviation airplanes become as obsolete as the first generation of jet airliners?
Hi, I'm Phil Boyer, president of the Aircraft Owners and Pilots Association. I know that we pilots are often surprised when the light airplanes we fly generate noise complaints or flight restrictions.
After all, the average residential neighborhood is filled with noises that are louder, longer in duration, and more frequent than overflying airplanes. Most people don't know that the actual ground level volume of a light airplane on climb-out is comparable to the ambient noise of a busy professional office. And it's significantly less than the noise from an interstate highway a quarter-mile away. In fact, as you can see, the typical noise level of a general aviation aircraft, when compared to most other noises in our lives, isn't that dramatic. You'd almost think that light airplanes would fade into the background, but they don't.
You see, scientific studies have shown that people perceive noise as being much louder and more pervasive than it really is. So any passing airplane is imagined to be a window-rattling intrusion into our domestic tranquility.
Whether people's perceptions of aircraft noise are accurate or not, more and more communities are taking steps to monitor and enforce noise reduction measures. In some locations, an array of sophisticated noise sensors tracks and reports airplanes creating noise in excess of local mandates. And in some communities, the benefits of access to the national air transportation system have been lost entirely when airports have been shut down.
In the next few minutes, we'll do two things. First, we'll examine the characteristics that make aircraft noise objectionable to people on the ground. And second, we'll explore some simple pilot techniques that will reduce our noise footprint considerably. But let's make one thing clear at the outset. The pilot's first responsibility is the safety of his passengers and people on the ground. We must make sure that any noise reduction procedure we use is safe and practical, given our personal capabilities and those of the airplane under prevailing conditions. Now, let's take a closer look at noise. The principal source of aircraft noise is the propeller, particularly on high-performance airplanes with constant speed props. The propeller tips at takeoff approach the speed of sound, and that creates a lot of noise. It follows that Operating the engine at the slowest RPM, consistent with safety, will create the least amount of noise. A reduction of as little as 200 RPM can reduce by half the perceived noise from a typical high-performance single. The second most important factor in aircraft noise is how close the airplane is to the listener. If we double the altitude or the lateral distance between our airplane and people on the ground, we generate only 1/4 the perceived noise as before. As little as 500 feet of additional altitude when we cross the airport boundary can cut our perceived noise in half. Now, numbers don't tell the whole story, though, because of the perception that noise is louder than it really is. For example, this sound is recorded on this tape at the same level as the following sound. Now, which one would we more likely think as noise? Well, one characteristic of sound becomes obvious. A harsh or unpleasant sound seems louder than a pleasant one. An airplane passing overhead may seem loud because, hard as it may be for us pilots to believe, many people perceive the sound as harsh. Another characteristic, in the same way that flashing lights attract more attention than steady lights, a dramatic change in the pitch or volume of a sound attracts attention. It should be obvious then that abrupt power or RPM changes will attract attention. Finally, noise is relative. Any sound in a normally quiet area will seem louder than it would in a noisy environment.
Once again, we look at the sea ice edge today from our Alaska Sea Ice desk, and the weather.gov/anchorage/ice.php site is always there if you want to analyze some of the ice conditions for yourself or read up on the latest outlook. One thing that we've been hearing from our sea ice experts is that as soon as the winds slow down across the Arctic coast, and they are doing that already, we're going to see a lot of this kind of flash freeze up fairly quickly. So anything that's thin right now or maybe not in place should freeze up fairly quickly as the water temperatures are primed and ready for that to happen. The one variable is the wind, and when that lays down, conditions will change fairly quickly, and we'll probably see some of that extend out into the Chukchi Sea coast as well. So be ready for some of those changes there. Across southeast, look for a south and westerly onshore wind from Yakutat all the way down toward the Dixon entrance, about 20 knots with 12 to 14-foot seas expected there. 3 to 4 foot seas on the inside waters with more of a southerly flow, 15 to about 20 knots. As we get into Monday, we'll get more of a northerly wind coming out of the Lynn Canal and into Stevens Passage and into the Chatham Strait area. Look for a southeasterly flow coming in across the Clarence Strait at 25 knots with 5-foot seas. That onshore push continues at 20 to 30 knots with winds picking up west of Craig, and easterlies develop around Yakutat, 15 knots with an 11-foot sea there on Monday. As we get into Sunday for the Prince William Sound region, an easterly flow at 25 knots with seas about 3 to 5 feet. East and southeasterly winds from the east of the Barrens all the way into the Hitchinbrook entrance, looking at 20 to 25 knots with 9 to 10-foot seas. Southerlies east of Kodiak Island, and northeasterlies are coming down Cook Inlet all the way through Shelikof Strait at 20 to 25 knots with seas 4 to 5 feet. Monday, winds diminish somewhat across the northern and western Gulf, and in some cases become variable throughout the day. Outside of Resurrection Bay, for example, about 10 knots with an 8-foot sea. Northeasterlies go light across Prince William Sound with a 2-foot sea, and inside Cook Inlet all the way down through areas west of the Barrens, 10 to 15 knots with 2 to 3-foot seas, and northeasterlies inside of Shelikof Strait also diminished to about 10 knots. We'll see similar conditions there east of Kodiak Island with an 8-foot sea. Around the Alaska Peninsula, northeasterlies inside of Bristol Bay, 20 knots from the north as you head from Port Heiden down to Cape Sarachev, a 7-foot sea there. Northwesterlies south of Sand Point, and southerlies from Castle Cape to Chignik with a 12-foot sea expected Sunday. That becomes northwesterly, as do the winds there in Bristol Bay for Monday. A northwesterly wind 15 to 20 knots should be expected with 2-foot seas there in Bristol Bay, 8-foot seas on the Pacific side, and westerlies from Port Heiden to Cape Sarachev, 15 knots with a 4-foot sea to start the week. Northwesterlies continue for the central and eastern Aleutians. A 9 to 13 foot sea is expected on the Bering side, 10 to 12 foot seas forecast there for the Pacific side. Winds begin to change a little bit as that frontal passage works across the western and west central chain there. A 10-foot sea for Kiska and out toward Attu, with 35-knot winds developing in the west, becoming southwesterly as we head into Monday. 30 to 35-knot winds there. We'll keep southerlies going across the central chain, and westerlies develop from Unalaska and Nikolsky on both the Bering and the Pacific side, with seas there around 7 feet and as high as 15 to 18 feet in the western chain for Monday. The west coast is still looking at offshore winds coming out of Norton Sound and across the YK Delta. Winds there will be around 20 to 30 knots with 7 to 10 foot seas. Freezing spray, especially closer to the ice edge in the north. Northeasterlies around the St. Matthew Island waters, and northerlies for the Pribilofs. A 20-knot wind there with a 7-foot sea diminishes to 10 knots as we get into Monday with a 5-foot sea on more of a variable wind. But we'll keep that northeasterly offshore wind along the YK Delta and Norton Sound, and over the St. Matthew Island waters. Northeasterlies continue there at 30 knots with a 7-foot sea. Across the Arctic coast, easterly winds are slowly lying down there from 20 to 35 knots, the highest around Kaktovik there from the east. North and easterly winds coming around the Chukchi seacoast, watching for freezing spray again closer to the ice edge. And for Monday, northeasterlies from Prudhoe Bay to Barrow and then around the Chukchi seacoast from 10 to 20 knots. You get an offshore wind there across Kaktovik, though, at 20 knots from the south and west. Recapping tonight's weather. Winds continue to diminish slowly around the upper Koyukuk Valley and the middle Yukon Valley. Turbulence issues there should slow down as well as we get into Sunday, but you're still going to have some gusts, and a wind advisory is in effect there. Look for pockets of snow showers to develop across south central and the Copper River Basin. Rain mainly along the southeastern coastline as low pressure continues to sit very close to Sand Point at 982 millibars. That level rises to 989 by Sunday, and we keep a trough of low pressure across the west, north, and eastern Gulf Coast. Snow showers will become a little further between as we get into Sunday. Dry weather continues for the interior. Breezes continue across the Arctic coast, and a new weather system moves into the western Bering and cruises across the Aleutians Monday. Thanks for watching Alaska Weather.
These forecasts are to be used for planning purposes only. Call 1-800-WX-BRIEF for a formal pre-flight briefing. Always file a flight plan before you go flying. The U.S. Coast Guard Auxiliary urges you to leave a float plan with a friend or the harbor master before you go boating. Alaska Weather is made possible by the following sponsors.
The National Weather Service.